Hello everyone, welcome to the Kevin Lee Social. Thank you for tuning in. What initially began as an 8-part series interviewing entrepreneurs to share and inspire how they've successfully pivoted during COVID-19, I have decided not only to continue this series, but also to expand on the scope to understand and learn about people's craft, philosophy, the challenges they face in the industry, and their favorite failures that have helped shape them to become who they are today. By going deeper and understanding different thought leaders, businesses, and industries, the idea is to help cross-pollinate ideas applicable in your life and inspire action in this new norm we live in. I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you. Today we have Bora Aydintug. Bora is a Netherlands-based experimental visual artist from Istanbul. He creates art experimentally in order to evoke curiosity and self-reflection in others. Originally an experimental filmmaker, he's focused on the intersection between art and technology during graduate studies at Tisch School of the Arts, led to programming various generative drawing systems and designing interactions. He now works with video, code, and physical computing in order to try and get a better sense of his own inner universe. Everyone, please help me welcome Bora. How are you, my friend?
I'm very good, thank you very much. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Thank you for tuning in all the way from Amsterdam. I appreciate you making the time for this, and I'm very grateful and thankful that you responded to my invitation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Bora, I wanted to start asking you about what experimental visual arts is to you, to lead with that.
I guess experimental art practice for me entails exploring without a set goal, being open to using tools out of their intended purpose or context, using tools without fully understanding them, and slowly approximating some type of understanding by doing, basically. And that understanding doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the tool. It can be like a self-reflectory. It usually is a process. That's what it is for me.
Yeah, thank you. And from just my research and understanding about your art, you generally involve multiple modalities, such as video, for yourself, code, and even physical computing. How did your journey begin, since from what I've read, you were originally a filmmaker?
I can say like the need to understand has been a driving force in all my work. And early on in my adolescence, I was fascinated with cinema, the potential to tell stories in an immersive way. So I wanted to do films, make films. I studied cinema and filmmaking and cinema in undergrad. And I really like the idea of being able to write stories that are about me, because the writing process is so that you make many drafts. And basically, I always checked for consistencies of characters in themselves, among each other. Therefore, I found myself considering the psychology of the characters, and then each iteration of the script turns into a kind of simulation. And since all that material is like autobiographical, it really becomes this quest to understand yourself, and it can be, basically. That's how I approached it, and that's why I wanted to go into video and film. And I wanted to do experimental things where I would give a prompt to the actors. The British director Mike Leigh, I believe, works this way. When he's writing scripts, what he does is he gives a general outline to the actors, actresses, and they just roll with it, and interesting ideas come out of those sessions, basically. So the type of being able to simulate things without going for like goals necessarily, also even when writing the script, being loose, starting really absurdly, and then slowly grounding the story and such, they all felt pretty fulfilling, to be honest with you. But the downside is that filmmaking is difficult in that it requires a lot of people. And at the same time, I was seeing my painter or sculptor friends. For sculptors, I suppose it's a little harder, but especially for my painter and musician friends, I was seeing them being able to create art on their own on a daily basis. Whereas with film, you really don't get to practice much. You have to like practice by doing, and doing isn't always logistically the easiest thing, which really pushed me not pushed me, I'm going to say, but it directed me towards stuff that I could do on my own. I first started doing like editing experimentally, in that I was cutting things up, creating new shapes out of videos. And then I wanted to create some interesting simulations in front of the camera. And I think a lot of people who at some level work with photography or video, they usually end up like dripping some ink in water.
I've seen that.
Yeah, so it's a very introductory thing, and you get these interesting shapes and colors. So I did that, and I stuck with it for a number of years and developed my own like fluid shooting technique, which I later realized was a little similar to my need to simulate things with narrative films, as in I'm now dripping two liquids into an environment and seeing them interact, basically. And they create all these new states and possibilities for each other and themselves, and the space as well. The space informs them. There are all these transitions that's, happening in many different directions at once. So the results are obviously hard to interpret. It's very abstract and hypnotic. I thought it's worth mentioning that it's pretty much complementary to my need to like do something and then take a step back and just observe that thing so I can think about it basically and reflect. So that basically like short narratives and writing them and directing them turned into like experimental video. Then I found myself with too little involvement, so to say, with what I'm doing, at least from a craftsman or an artist's perspective. So I found it hard to then claim some artistic, like, not intent really, but there's much to experience and talk about my fluid art. But the results are not strongly connected to my ability or my intentions, other than making it possible. So it was after a while, it became, I started feeling the need to also have some analytical processes in my mind as well, to couple with intuition and then possibly make more interesting things. And I found out about this program in New York called ITP. It's under NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. It's a program that combines technology and art. They have this slogan, it goes art school for engineers and engineering school for artists. And it really intrigued me as well. And I had all these like liquid footages. And at that time I had already started doing some generative work in After Effects. So I was discovering the noise algorithm, which is at the core of generative art, like the Perlin noise, which basically is a way to draw all different types of natural patterns, from smoke to trees to mountains to fluids. So that was also very intriguing. So I felt this place could be interesting, and it really turned out to be very interesting. And in more days than I imagined, I ended up progressing into EEG art there as well.
Just to quickly interrupt before we move on with the story, I'll put a bookmark there. Can you just quickly describe or explain to the audience what generative art is? Maybe not everyone understands what that is.
Sure. So generative art is, I don't know necessarily it has to be digital, but it is, I hope I'm right, but I think it is art that can be created algorithmically, meaning there is a set of rules and an order to those rules that the program follows to create the art, basically, and it can be affected or created from mathematical like algorithms.
And so, yes, you go into the school in New York, and then you've got into generative art and then into EEG, and you can continue the story from there. Yeah.
I always was intrigued by the idea, not always, but I was intrigued by the idea of being able to get some real-time feedback loop out of one's own mind through an output that's relevant and noticeable. And it's usually in the form of audio or visuals. I came across this instrument in one of Isaac Asimov's foundation books, the Visi Sonor or something. I believe, if I remember correctly, in that setting, it was being used to like manipulate people, hypnotize them. But I do remember that it would be really interesting to create art like that and also experience or share yourself like that for other people to experience. So when I went to ITP, I noticed a course called Introduction to Neuroscience and Transformative Technologies. It was taught by, he's a neuroscientist at NYU. And he also is as a psychologist and used to be a Buddhist monk for quite a number of years, I believe.
Wow.
So he's interested in the human mind, and I mean, about the human mind and from various different angles. That was a very interesting class. Around the same time, I noticed, I did know that people were making EEG art, and I had already tried like doing some things by connecting the headset to a visual program, but I didn't really get like a good connection between what I was feeling or experiencing and what the waves were doing, brain waves. So I'd given up, and then I saw this musician Jason Snell. He has I'm going to say a show called Primary Assembly. It's this project where he creates music from his brainwaves. And I attended a demonstration and a talk by him. And then we got to talking afterwards. And he basically said it's about mapping creatively to the differences from changes in the brain state. But he also is a meditator. What he does is more performative, where he actually starts meditating. And the more he meditates, things are happening with the music. And I remember he did tell of this account where once he was on stage with this, I believe, larger than usual sound system, larger than what he usually works with. And apparently the feedback became so strong because of the vibration coming from the speakers. He said he felt his consciousness expanded basically to a degree that he hadn't experienced before, I believe. Maybe he had experienced it, but not possibly in a public setting. That really intrigued me. So I wanted to also get this kind of feedback loop. And I then started looking for different ways of measuring attention, relaxation, and things that I could think of. And I started finding some indexes from some neuroscience papers, and my professor was also helpful in that. And then I started mapping them to different behaviors experimentally. So rather than thinking what they are doing, I wanted to experience what they're doing. So this development process basically became like a few months of trial and error of me sort of like, I'm not going to say meditating because it's like open eye, but it was a meditative process, I'm going to say, or it's maybe a process in its own. But so I was able to get some different feedbacks going, some with attention, some with relaxation. And I did notice on 3 occasions certain triggers that triggered certain behaviors. And when I say triggers, it's one of them was saying my late father's name and remembering him in a warm context. And that's not like a switch, like it wouldn't do it maybe now, but in that moment with the music I was listening to, where my mind was at, it really seemed to work. Basically what I'm doing while drawing, my eyes open, is really dependent on my mood on that day. So it's always open for exploration as to what things do what, but there's obviously a delay, and it's not what people expect it is, I'm finding.
That's actually the artwork, how I found out about you, about the EEG artwork. It was through a private Facebook group of transformative technologies in the meditation space. And one of the moderators had shared your EEG post to check out. And it was a video on Vimeo, I think, represents you sharing your work. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I was a big fan straight away, and I had to connect with you. And so to give the audience an idea of what I had saw and what Bora is explaining is essentially, imagine a headband that has some sensors in it, and that senses your brainwaves. And if I'm correct, Bora, you've given it certain algorithms to interpret different brainwaves to
Yeah.
generate art on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as Bora was saying, depending on the mood, then a different artwork would be drawn, and it would be a unique, almost unique to the person because of all the different ranges of brainwaves that they have at that certain time, and everyone has different moods at different times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which I found very interactive and it was a very interesting piece, I thought. But I thank you for sharing that. That was something that I'd really like to further look into. Thank you, Bora.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you saying that. And like you say, people's brainwaves, they do differ from hour to hour, basically. And the same variation exists among different people too. So it's basically it turned into an endeavor where I had to get to know myself better to actually make it happen. It really felt organic in that way. Like the project growing is me growing too, and it's not all something that I always find with the project. So it definitely was transformative to work on that.
Okay. Great. Has your heritage and upbringing in Istanbul influenced your outlook on work? From my understanding, you were brought up in Istanbul and then moved to New York for studying, and then now currently in Amsterdam. So it's a bit of a move to different places.
I was actually born in the UK, where both my parents were studying. They were originally from Turkey, so they were there for education purposes. So I went to Turkey when I was 3.5 years old. And for personal reasons, which I'd rather not disclose, my parents were not with me when I came. So I did not see my parents for a year. And I believe what happened is that, so I was in this new place, new faces, new people, new language, new smells, new streets, everything new, except for myself. And I believe I witnessed some sort of transition happening, like one simulation was replaced with a new one. And since I had no familiarity, I think I experienced everything dissolving. And not in my EEG work, but in most of my generative abstract work, I see myself trying to recreate the same kind of experience. And this, I believe, is also a tool for understanding oneself. Transitions in general are very useful. A loss, like moving, like changing a place. Obviously, if it's going to be a trauma that's overwhelming, then maybe it's not immediately very constructive. But if it's something that the person can handle, I think transitions are really conducive of growing. The way I think about it is I come from a video background. So when you open a video editing software, what you see first is the black screen because the timeline's empty. So let's say that black screen represents the container in which the video, the narrative, everything's taking place. If you put two videos there and place a perfectly timed crossfade transition, we're just going to see one video becoming the other. But with us, our inner systems are so multifaceted and complex, transitions aren't necessarily taking place simultaneously and perfectly timed, and things take different time. And in the video setting, if you had a crossfade transition that isn't perfectly timed, so it's not maybe a crossfade anymore, you are going to see during the transition some of the blackness of the background. So the container will actually be revealed during the transition. That's why I feel like transitions generally are very hypnotic and meditative, but they can also become tools of escapism. I believe there's like a balance to be minded. Maybe it's straying too much from the question, but in terms of the cultural background, when we talk about Istanbul, I mean, they regard Istanbul as a place that connects like East and West together. But I mean, it is true to a degree, but it still is, I believe, in many ways, a product of the Eastern culture. At least the people are. I am too, regardless of what I believe and so forth. And since Eastern cultures, at least Islamic culture, is not big on figures, And they say a lot of non-figurative artists and abstract artists come from like the Middle East or Turkey. There are a great number of, I believe, Turkish, not a great number, but I'm gonna guess it's an unusually high number of Turkish generative artists. And I think this is one reason behind that, because patterns play, I think, bigger part in our visual minds, so to say, than a Westerner. That might be something noteworthy. I can't say if it has any role in how I look at things, but I can say I remember when I said I came when I was 3.5 years old. The big part of my experience was also boredom. I was bored. I was with my grandparents. I was very bored. And I was looking at things, looking at patterns, looking at walls, like the patterns on the marbles, and imagining things. So in my case, it just might be that, really, or it's a combination of both.
And it makes absolute sense. And I do agree with you. There are, from what I've seen anyway, a decent sized number of emerging artists from Turkey in the generative space as well, and they do amazing work like yourself. So it's very fascinating to hear your thoughts behind that. And I think this is a good segue into understanding a bit more about your art, because you were talking about transitions earlier, and that was an amazing explanation. Thank you for that. From what I've read, you've mentioned that you create art to evoke curiosity and self-reflection in others. What kind of concepts do you try to get people to think about?
I wish there was a clear concept I directed people towards. In the context of my fluid art, maybe I should say first, in the context of generative arts, that curiosity is usually directed towards, at least immediately, directed towards nature and math. And in the fluid works, that connection still exists. There is definitely much to be experienced or observed in terms of mathematics or nature, but also there is a great self-reflective, or I'm going to say free associative potential. And what I mean by free association basically is the way we liken shapes to other things, clouds to sheep first. But the idea is, once you stick with these free associations, after a while, those associations become your own. Now they're like, if I make a number of associations continuously while staying in the same cognitive space, then I start to make my own associations deriving from my own world of meanings. Therefore, I'm pretty big on psychology. Therefore, in that regard, my wish would be to let people realize that there is this causality between how they act and how they have felt throughout their life and what the story was, basically. But I could say that's the curiosity that I want to inspire in terms of my fluid work. Although this is not to say it's not for everybody. Obviously, people also should have the freedom to look at themselves when they are ready to look at themselves, and it should be a decision that they make themselves. Therefore, I'm not envisioning a world that everybody knows everything about. No one should also know everything about, or try to know everything about themselves anyways. But I do think it is very unfortunate that when someone wants to reflect or heal, there aren't enough resources for that. There aren't enough psychologists in the world to actually, even if psychology works. So I don't know. There's definitely, this is not an informed answer to the lack of opportunities of healing in the world. But when I say I want to inspire things, it's basically deriving from this awareness that people cannot heal even if they are ready to, or even if they want to. Not always, which is pretty unfortunate.
I do agree with that. It's there's a lot of mental challenges that people face around the world. To reaffirm what you say, that there's not enough resources, not enough help, and even if they do have access to it, it doesn't always help, because they need to take it on for themselves. They need to make that decision for themselves, and sometimes they can't come to that for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And talking about mental challenges at the moment, at the time of this recording, we're still going through the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how are you managing your projects at the moment, or how have you been maneuvering around this pandemic?
So we were in New York when the pandemic began, and began strong in New York. It was like the hotspot for a few months in, I believe, March, April. And I was there with my wife Nair, and we were living, the two of us. But since I was like intensely going to school, I had some school friends, but we didn't really have an extensive social circle. I felt actually alone, and that led us to be, I'm guessing, more careful than we would have been if we were, in Istanbul or somewhere, that we had a social circle or support system. So since we were, I mean, also that this goes for everybody. There is no guideline to how much safe is enough. Therefore, like, the inclination is to try and be as safe as you can. So it's definitely been a challenge. I mean, there were facets of social life which I did not enjoy before, and I found myself missing those things, even because, like, I noticed, even when I complain about having to do certain things, having to go see certain people, that social interaction does something for me. Maybe not intellectually, but that's not the essence, that's not all of who I am. It's a self-discovery process in the end. And I noticed, because I'm a person who likes to be alone, who tends to like to be alone. And first I was like, okay, this should be fine. And this is obviously after I realized that the humanity can go through this. And then I'm like, okay, I can sit this out for a few years, no problem. But it wasn't that easy, to be honest with you. So I was a little overconfident in my loneliness skills. I don't know.
It is a different world that we've been living in, even for those of us who think we're generally quite comfortable alone. But when it comes to an extended period of time, it does bring out the true nature that we are at heart social creatures of some sort.
Definitely, we need, definitely desperately need other people, which is what a human being is. There is no human being without other human beings.
Absolutely.
It's not a singular thing, for sure.
To move on to, what do you think about the future of experimental art or even generative art?
The issue is, like, I call myself an experimental visual artist because this is what I do, type of thing. If I try to describe what I do, this is at least to me, this is the most accurate description of what I do. But there's an issue of relevancy and context with what I do, at least right now. I don't know how to frame or ground what I do. With the EEG artwork, I suppose it's easier because it's EEG artwork. But with fluids, or I have a lot of experiments which are just that, experiments. I basically create a number of rules that acts as a container. Then I go inside and really start playing without understanding. And I get really interesting and intriguing results. But I suspect I do it more for the experience of it, that exploration without a goal type of thing. And therefore, as interesting as the results may be visually, I think they are stuck in being eye candy because there is no context. The only context is that it's experimental. So I don't know if there is a discipline that kind of works that way, or a movement, really. This again comes to the issue of relevancy, because I, like I said, create for personal reasons as well. And therefore, I'm obviously doing art because of other people doing art. Like, I witnessed that this is a possibility and everything, but I'm not inspired by, I'm definitely inspired by what people do, because everything is a remix and so on. So I'm not claiming I'm doing like something that's 100% authentic or anything, but what my contemporaries are doing, I don't have a great handle on the current climate of art, to be honest with you. So it's difficult for me to think about the future of experimental arts, but I think we do need kind of art making systems that are inclusive in the sense of they're including everyone, because maybe inclusive is not the right word, but I just want to say, I think the experience that I describe, the joy of, experimenting without a set goal, I think there is merit in letting other people experience that too. I have done a few drawing systems where people could draw interesting things with their own inputs onto a screen through a control panel. And that involves a lot of fabrication, but I'm still hoping to go back to that concept too, where people can create visuals without having to say what those visuals are just because they want to, and lose track of time doing that. So basically let people have fun, be happy. So I hope that kind of art we will see more of that kind of art, because the way I see it now with generative art, what's happening is that new abilities are being showcased. Some works feel like a tech demo, and I remember during a show where I was showcasing my drawing system, quite a large number of people either asked me or tried to see if it was motion activated, basically, because people are now used to having this experience catered to them, and that's turning into the essence of generative art. Someone's dancing and the whole wall is reacting, but I think real exploration and curiosity, they require agency on behalf, on part of the observer. It has to be an active participation, I believe, for art to serve a purpose. So that's one thing. This is maybe not for experimental art per se, but generative art in the future, I hope it will facilitate more experimentation for the audience or the participator than creating this moment, this eye and ear candy. A certain feeling is delivered and then you move on type of thing. I think we shouldn't move on. If it's an experience that's constructive, that's interesting, then it's going to stick with you, and we should probably...
I understand exactly where you're coming from. Or I'm reading a lot and I'm looking a lot and I'm scrolling through a lot of different generative and interactive artworks. And as you mentioned, a lot of it is pure eye candy or a display of technology to showcase, look at this robot arm, follow this movement. We've just more constant bridging of technology to simply showcase creating art for the sake of creating art in that sense. And I appreciate your method of, when it comes to experimental art, at least you create a set of rules and those become the boundaries and you can get experimental within those boundaries. I think that's a lovely piece for innovation a lot of the time, because you can't just go, let's just innovate with everything. You've got to create that boundary, as you said, a set of rules, and then you can start really playing around in that space to bring out something that you go, oh, that's interesting, or maybe that'll work, or whatnot. And while we're on the topic of technology, NFTs are a big thing that's thrown around these days in the whole technology art space. What are your thoughts on NFT? I'm curious.
I had created a few of them, not myself. I don't code blockchain, but I had done through a marketplace for a cryptocurrency startup my friend is a part of. But this was before the craze, so I didn't know what I was doing. I just minted a number of them, and then the craze happened, and then I started reading about what it isn't, and someone said once the dust settles, there'll probably be purpose, a fitting function of this technology, which we will then be happy to have, but it doesn't seem to be doing its intended thing at the moment, and it feels a little uncertain, to be honest with you. And I'm not saying that this is the essence of the NFT market, but I strongly suspect that what one can sell depends also on what one can market. So not seeing people put like the art part of the NFT almost feels like an afterthought at this point. So it's definitely not something that feels like it revolves around art, but it's using art as a justification. That's how what it feels to me, at least to a degree. I'm sure there are marketplaces where they value art more, which uses more eco-friendly currencies, but in general, the hype, I think, and I think it died down a bit too. No, it's not what it was like 5-6 months ago. But that's what I feel like. I'm very curious to see what it's going to evolve to, and what the whole blockchain thing is going to evolve to, because I suspect I'm not going to be able to understand what it exactly is until we're like using it. You know,
I definitely agree with that. I believe that the technology is definitely here to stay, but in what form and for what use, I guess that's where we'll find out later on. Like there are discussions about NFTs being used probably more in the smart contracts kind of industry versus, like you said, the art it's this massive bubble where at any time 90% or so of it will just disappear. But it's, everyone's a hot buzzword at the moment, and everyone's talking about it. So just curious to get your opinion. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into your process, and you may or may not be able to share this, but you can share as much or as little as you like. What's your thought process or questioning that goes through your mind when you're tackling a new project? And you could use as a case study of something that's been given to you that as a project. Okay, Bora, this is what we're working the confines with. Let's create an experimental or generative art with that. Or it could be something that you've decided to come up with your own. You might have, like you said, due to the patterns in your childhood or transitions or whatnot, you've decided, okay, I want to do something with this. I'm curious to see your framework or the kind of thought process that you go through.
Personally, I find it a challenge to conceive projects and complete them. This is probably a very common problem for people who create, but it's hard to know when the piece is done, when the project is done. Instead, what I do a lot of the time is to keep creating, not to have downtime. But this sometimes ends up providing some outputs that then can be morphed into a project. But more often than not, it's as an experiment, basically. Like, for instance, with my fluid works, the more I couldn't figure out what to do with them, the more I shot them. So I have tens of hours of footage now after it's being cleaned up. And I have hundreds of like very different generative images from various different categories and moods. So that really is something I'm trying to tackle or work on. Basically, I'm struggling with providing a sort of context that tells people why, or like why they should be interested in my work, or from what perspective they should approach it. Not should, but could, or at least from what perspective I approached it. And honestly, this interview is possibly the most open I've been about my process to myself too. Therefore, we'll see. But currently, if it's a project that I'm doing for someone else, meaning if there's a deadline, then what I'll do is to start working, basically, and figure things out along the way. This usually works, but this usually works, to be honest with you, but I feel like if I create some sort of protocol for at least some parts of my process, then things could be more efficient. There's always that idea of, could I have actually done this in a shorter amount of time? I mean, the only rush is to do more work, obviously, but if not, then that's okay too. Then this is my process, obviously, like I said. But I do feel like I need to do some sort of crystallizing of what I'm about, basically. So it's easier for other people to communicate to my work or communicate to themselves through my work.
That takes some time to clarify and crystallize, and as the interaction.
And hopefully it'll keep changing throughout my life too. I hope to always remain a student as well. A concept that I always think about, I don't know if it's going to be possible to organically edit this in, but
yeah, please share.
A good friend of mine many years ago, while we were watching some of my fluid artwork together, pointed out that the ground object relationship or the ground figure relationship was being not distorted, but it was always changing and shifting. Basically, what he was saying was that he was perceiving an object in front of a background, but slowly the object became the background and new objects formed, basically. And I started thinking about that. And throughout the years, I realized that this has implications in everything we do. According to Gestalt psychology, when I imagine someone, for instance, I always imagine them with a surrounding rather than in a black vacuum space with nothing around them. Therefore, the person is always contextualized by their surrounding, basically. And this comes up with individualism, consumerism, where we are too hung up on the abilities or the needs of the figure, and we disregard the ground, the environment, the planet that sustains us, basically. This then comes up again in the example I gave about people expecting generative art pieces to just do a lot by a single wave of hand. Again, the figure assumes so much power in being able to define the ground that the figure forgets that it's the ground that makes the figure, basically. So there's like a relationship there that we seem to miss. And this is also one sort of filter or tool that I'd say not a main concept maybe that I'm trying to draw attention to, but it is a tool of checking myself, asking myself, what am I saying, for instance, here in terms of ground and figure relationship. And it's not like there are certain things that I won't say or something, but if I'm saying something, I want to make sure the other things I'm saying are consistent with that, or at least they talk to each other in some sense. So this is definitely one check that I make when I'm thinking about new projects. As I said previously, to me, the best method that works is to start working.
I understand that. It came up this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost the understanding of almost like a duality piece where, I don't know how this might come out weird, but when one of my teachers were sharing with me, is like when you look at a tree, and then the light from the back comes through the tree. And if it wasn't for the gaps between the leaves and the light to come through, you would not be able to see the leaves, the distinct features, the leaves of the tree. That is what I think of when you were explaining the ground and the object. Because if there was no light that was coming through all the gaps, then it would just simply be a block.
I see. That's a different duality, but it's a very fundamental one. It's it's not different, but to me, it's like this is a lot to think about. Very interesting.
I wanted to move on to, are you excited about any upcoming projects in 2021? Or even 2022 at this point?
Well, I am very excited for 2021 in that we have just moved to Amsterdam. I'm setting up like a new studio. And hopefully now I will divide my time, hopefully skillfully, between my fluid artworks and my EEG art, because there are a lot of different areas that I feel like I can go to. And I know that like Renaissance person is not a real thing. At least for me, I know that if I don't focus on something, it's not going to be very good. Hopefully, I can focus on those two things. I do like generative art. I do experimental part of it. But at present, while working on EEG art, basically is creative interpretation anyways. So it does basically include most of what I like about generative art. So it's a good shortcut to be working on EEG art, because it is generative art and fluid art. I enjoy doing that, and I'm hoping to do that in a live setting, because I did actually, before going to the US, I was inviting people over, and this was like a twice a week type of thing where people would come. I would perform for them for an hour, and then we talk if they wanted to. It was there that I basically realized that not everyone is into talking about themselves, and not everyone is ready to, or not everyone should. If they don't want to, there's no forcing them. Because I remember at first being offended with people, but if they don't want to open up, they really shouldn't have to. But so I wanna do that in a live capacity. We'll see how things go. But my goal this year is to create work that is ready to be showed, or shown, displayed. Because sometimes I do very interesting things, and I don't do them in high enough resolutions, and I just move on to the new thing. And then maybe 2 years later, someone says, "Oh, this is great. Let's put this in somewhere in a gallery." And you're like, "Oh, I don't have a big enough version of that." So this year, I'm definitely gonna be creating as if I'm preparing for a show, and then show.
I wanted to, maybe we can go back to a little bit about the future of your EEG work. I don't know if we can retouch on that topic. Are you able to share more about what you're working on moving forward with the EEG work, or that's something under the wraps at the moment, or still consideration?
I am now looking at different ways to draw, and I am maybe not actively on the lookout for new metrics or algorithms, but I would very much be interested in being able to visualize more things, because I'm definitely after that feedback loop. And at this point, although it's hard, I also want that feedback loop for other people to experience. Having said that, I believe a program needs to be created, an app that has a good sort of calibration and an interface and things like that, make any EEG experience an interactive one. The algorithms that I have are a little more non-generalized, and initial calibration would be necessary for other people to be able to experience them, because I did some playtesting, and for some of them I had to rerun the sketch 3-4 times, adjusting the values before they actually felt something. Whereas the person next to them just did it on the first try. Everyone's different, like I said. So there is definitely great potential in interaction design with EEG. But in terms of my own artwork, I am now exploring use of physics, because in my own, in my previous artwork, what I'm visualizing is not what I'm visualizing, but there are a flock of birds. So there's this algorithm for steering behavior in flocks of birds, and this is the 2D implementation of it. And the reason I use that is that we have spatial thinking in our minds, which apparently allows us to navigate inside three-dimensional environments. Like when we're a child, we're running around our home, not hitting things or sometimes hitting them. What's happening is we are developing that navigation skill within a 3D environment. And to be able to do that, we have to have the simulation of that in our minds. So basically, our minds are familiar with physics simulations. And I think the feedback loop, it's not just dependent on one or two factors. It's probably there are a number of factors that enable a feedback loop. And I think the fact that the particles were moving in a way that is more familiar and feels like they are also moving in a physical space. There's drag, there's acceleration. When they decide to turn, like I said, there's a drag. And so it makes the immersion stronger, basically, the feedback loop stronger. So I want to go further into that with physics simulations, basically. Particles maybe touching each other, bouncing back off of each other.
No, I'm curious to see where you go with that. I also read something recently, and I thought of you, and it was about QEEG, so quantitative EEG. So it's more of it's the mapping of a brain in a the algorithms are sent, so it gives it the visual representation of where parts of the brain light up, or parts of that light up. And there's this part of the brain called the cortex. So if this is our spine and it runs up, the cortex is like a strip over the center of that limbic system. And then you've got the gray matter on top of that, which most people consider part of the brain. And so that's a connection between your feeling and thinking brain. And the cortex through the center, there's two parts to it. There's the anterior cingulate cortex, which is at the front, and the posterior, which is at the back. And the anterior is what is normally with logic and attention and focus, whereas the back, which is the DM, like they call it the default mode network, it's more associated with daydreaming and letting go. And so in a particular case, for example, when people are meditating or when they're focusing, they're trying to activate more of the anterior cingulate cortex, which is at the front part of the brain, lights up. That activity lights up. But then, as with everyone, you start to lose focus and your mind wanders. So then it travels back to the back, and the back part lights up. And then you realize that you've lost thoughts, you've lost your attention. And so you bring it back to the front. And they call that movement, or Jeff Tarrant at least has coined it, the dance of the cingulate cortex. And it's the lighting of the front and the back of the brains as they light up back and forth. And I thought of you when that came up. I was like, maybe Bora might be interested.
Yes, I have tried front versus back type of comparisons, because I think the emotive interaction that I mentioned did the same thing, front versus back. What I'm looking at right now is more like relative alpha. Then I'm looking at alpha in different parts of the brain and comparing. We'll see.
That's incredible. So I'm really excited for both advancements in both areas of fluid and your EEG art. I've seen samples of both, and they're amazing. I will definitely put it in the show notes and the links for people to check it out and traffic over your way. It's definitely worth checking out for everyone who's curious about this space. It's hypnotic, it's mesmerizing, and it depending on which piece you look at, it invokes definitely some thought patterns.
Thank you.
And as we reach the final quarter of our interview, there'll be some short fire questions, and it doesn't have to be short. You can go for as long as you like, just around a bit more of your personal routines. Do you have any morning or evening routines that you follow, Bora?
Not very well, to be honest with you. Like, there are things I want to do, but so this is also related to COVID. I started waking up throughout the night. I was doing that before. When I was stressed, I would wake up, maybe feel the need to eat something. By the way, eating sugar close to bedtime is I think, for me, it's wrong to do it, because I think when my blood sugar drops, I wake up. Anyhow, I try to avoid that. It's my routine. And I actually try to set an intention before going to bed, saying I'm not going to wake up. I don't know if it works. Like, I don't wake up, so I'm sure it helps. And in the morning, it's just get to that first cup of coffee. But to be fair, I always drink a large glass of water before doing anything else. I know that helps, but nighttime and morning time are kind of a hassle for me, to be honest with you.
Do you have a certain ritual before you get into your creative process, or it is just head down, get to work, and then let the magic start?
Sometimes it helps to do some cleaning or other tasks in the house to actually get into flow of doing things. But more often than not, I find myself starting to work to avoid overthinking in the end. Because Although I said that, like, the best thing that works is to start working for me. Before that happens, I usually try to think about what I'm going to do, but I'll turn that into overthinking. So I usually end up starting to work to stop the overthinking, and then things start flowing, basically. Having said that, though, this is not something I specifically do before I work, but I try to relax as much as I can. I try to, like, look at patterns, like when I take a walk, look at the surface of the water. So I'm constantly trying to, like, experience. I'm experiencing without trying, but I'm also trying to see alternative ways of experiencing. I'm trying to bring myself to that, open myself up to that. And I try to be kind to myself in that I try not to value overworking very much, because we have that tendency in our modern cultures to, like, overvalue people who are hardworking. But I think people who know how to relax, that's also a very good skill too. And if you can especially relax constructively, not that it's easy, but so I believe those help me work better.
Do you have a favorite book that you like to recommend?
I do have some favorite books that have been important to me throughout my life. Let's see. Okay, so I don't know. I read 2001: A Space Odyssey in middle school by Arthur C. Clarke. That was amazing to me. So was Solaris by Stanislav Lem. I think Crime and Punishment is like an essential book everyone should read. I don't know. Camus' Stranger. Everyone should read. It doesn't sound right. Not everyone should read it. It's a good way to actually think about crime and punishment.
Who's that one by? Do you have the author by any chance?
Sorry?
Do you know the author of that one by any chance?
Crime and Punishment is Dostoevsky.
Okay.
And Stranger is by Camus. Then one book that I kept going back to in my mind has been Guns, Germs, and Steel, basically based on the difference between the level of technology in different continents and why that is. And it's asking, why did the Spanish invade South America and not the South Americans invading Spain? Like, why didn't it happen the other way around? What was the deciding factor, type of thing? And to me, it was a good segue into thinking about the world as a bigger system. I think that book it was a good segue. These books are, I think, have been fundamental to me. And now I do enjoy reading books about things like embodied cognition, or I just started reading this book, Incognito. It's about how the brain works. These books, like, you can spend half an hour on a single page. It's a different experience than definitely reading fiction, but it's also very fulfilling. I like anime very much, actually, and I would say Genesis Evangelion, but I don't know how to pronounce it in English. But in Akira, they're great. I like Tarkovsky.
Definitely classics.
Definitely. And cinema, film-wise, I really like Tarkovsky's talk. I like Brazil, the director's cut, the one with a darker ending. Slightly. I had written these down, so I don't know. I just listed them out. But
awesome. Thank you for that. There's a lot of the titles actually I haven't heard about, so I'm definitely going to check them out since it's your recommendations.
Nice, thank you.
Are there any new beliefs or behaviors that have had a positive impact in your life in recent years?
Yes, I have found through psychotherapy that patience and faith are very good values, and these values shouldn't necessarily be only existing in the domain of religion or spirituality. I think these are important for everyone. I found, because basically to be able to change, you have to be patient, basically, and to be able to stay patient, you have to have faith. It's a whole system. Otherwise, change is like very difficult. And if, for instance, like, there are some concepts that, at least in my personal life, maybe like my life in Turkey, I've seen them being used or only in religious contexts, and one gets a certain type of allergy then towards some of the notions, but it It's just that these notions are universal anyways. It doesn't matter who wants to capitalize on them and who does. So I've definitely found that patience and faith are very crucial. And I think they are crucial because they are allowing change. And I think the main purpose of change is to be able to fully love and be fully loved at the end of the day. So it all comes to and goes back to, at least in my mind and in my heart, to love. So this notion has been strengthened, I'm going to say, in the last years, because this was something I knew somehow, but maybe hadn't articulated. But the more I was able to go near it, approximate it, then it was more visible, so to say.
I think you articulated it very well. I think there's a very important point that everyone should consider, and you brought up in terms of psychotherapy. It's something that I've been looking a little bit more into, that more and more people should go and consider, myself included. But that point of self-reflection, patience, and faith, and with that non-religious attachment to it too, is important. Second last question. If you could only send one single line of SMS text to yourself 5 years ago, what would it be?
Good question. I would say keep going, and I love you. Keep going. Because there's always like too much panic, right? There's always like this sense of this trouble, this problem that's not real. It's not like identifiable, but it's there, and you always end up seeing that it was unnecessary after, like when you look back. But it's again in a different form. It's always there, so it's always good to remind yourself feeling this way, but it's okay.
Definitely a beautiful piece there. And finally, Bora, how could people reach out or learn more about you?
Learn more about me. I am going to actually recreate my artist statement with the help of this interview. I believe I mentioned that to you before, and so that will be on my website, which is Bora Aydintug. It's Aydintug, my name and last name.com. There's my Instagram, which is a great way to reach me too. So email and Instagram are definitely a good way to reach me. And the links to both are also on my website. So it should be fairly easy.
I will pop them on the show notes. Thank you so much for your time and knowledge and wisdom that you've shared tonight. Thank you for your patience. It has been eye-opening, and you've intrigued a lot of thought and curiosity within myself with this interview process. So there's definitely had to re-listen to this interview more than 2 or 3 times to really consider everything that you've shared along the way, because I do think it deserves more thought, more thinking behind it. I've really enjoyed this process, and thank you so much.
Thank you for this great time. Thank you for this great opportunity to be open. Thank you for your well thought out questions, and it's been great for me as well.
Also, I wanted to show appreciation for how candid you've been with this interview, being open with your thoughts and your processes. So I will be following your work closely and can't wait to see more. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. All the links to the show notes will be available at kevinleesocial.com, spelled KEVINLY. Conversely, if you have any interviews that you'd love to recommend, please send it over to kevinleesocial@gmail.com. I'd love to connect. Thank you. Until the next episode.